So this lesson is lesson 2 of revision for research methods, and if you are using the booklet that has been given to you in lessons, then make sure you've got the second half of that booklet in front of you. But if you haven't got a booklet, don't worry, you can still complete it. Just make sure you've got paper in front of you and you follow the instructions that are on the screen. So what are you going to need? Like I've said, whatever sheets you're using, whether that be just paper or whether that be the booklet that you have been given, 2 different coloured pens. I want you to focus on the first coloured pen to do without your notes and without any help from the video or me, and then the second coloured pen going through with the video to make sure that you can check exactly what you need further revision of. I'd also recommend having your research methods booklet in front of you, any notes on research methods or a textbook, just so you can triple check as well, just in case it goes too quick. So next things to do then. We're going to be focusing on experimental methods, experimental designs and ethics for this lesson. So I'm going to go through some definitions and stuff first and then give you some time to do some exam questions and then we will mark them. So let's get started. First of all, the first table I want you to fill in is about the different types of experiment and the different experimental designs. So pause the video, try and time yourself about 3 to 4 minutes, see how much you can get done. So experimental methods, experimental designs, what is the definition and descriptions? Give yourself a few minutes and pause the video whilst you are doing it. So hopefully you've got those filled in. So get your second colour pen. Anything that you need to add in, obviously do it in that second colour just to show yourself exactly what it is that you need to revise. So let's go through the experimental method first. Experimental methods, first of all, lab experiment. The independent variable is manipulated and the environment is quite controlled or artificial. A field experiment, you still manipulate that independent variable, you still might have numerous different conditions that you've manipulated as a researcher, but the environment is in a more realistic setting and it's not really that controlled. Natural, the independent variable is fixed to the environment. So it's something that you cannot manipulate as a researcher, it is naturally occurring. An example might be a natural disaster like an earthquake or volcano eruption. You can compare before this incident happened to afterwards. And the environment is more realistic. A quasi-experiment, the independent variable is still fixed to the participant. That's something like gender or age that you cannot manipulate as a researcher, but you may want to research. And the environment is highly controlled, like it is in a lab experiment. So just double check your different types of experiments, see if you got any of those right. Next, we should have already done the experimental designs. So 3 experimental designs. If you've not quite finished those, pause the video again, give yourself another couple of minutes and see if you can fill in the definitions and descriptions with your first coloured pen. Those of you who have already done it, let's look at the answers. Change colour to the second colour so again you can see what it is you need to revise. So independent groups, different groups of people do different conditions. However many conditions you've got, whether that be 2, you get 2 different groups. 1 group does each condition. If you've got 3 conditions, you'd need 3 different groups of people. Matched pairs, you'd still have different groups of people that complete the different conditions, but they are matched based upon their personal qualities. So it might be things like age, gender, IQ that these individuals are matched on. And then 1 person from the pair does each condition. And then repeated measures, 1 group of participants, they complete all the conditions. So they might complete 2 conditions, they might complete 3 different conditions, but it's the same group of people that do them. So hopefully you should have a good overview of your definitions now. But we need to remember, we need to know how to evaluate every single one of these. So there's a few key terms that I want you to try and define. These are validity, reliability, researcher bias, order effects and demand characteristics. Whilst you're doing it, don't look at your notes, write them down in your first colour pen and then we will check through. Try and time yourself, give yourself a couple of minutes, see how far you get. So let's look at the definitions then. First of all, validity. Validity means how accurate a measure is. Reliability is the consistency of a measure. Researcher bias is when the researcher, whether they know it or not, influences the results to fit the aim. This could be by influencing the participants, it could be just by interpreting things or writing things down in a little bit of a different way to what they were intended to be. The researcher might know they're doing it, they might mean to, but it might be an unconscious thing that they haven't got the control over and haven't meant to do. Order effects, they come with the repeated measures. Now, order effects is when one group of participants, they complete more than one condition, but after the first condition they might become quite bored, tired, they might guess the aim, so they change their behaviour, and that's not because of the manipulation of the IV, it is because of these order effects. So that impacts the dependent variable and will reduce the validity of the study. And then demand characteristics, when the participant guesses the aim and changes their behaviour to what they think the researcher wants. It might not actually be what the researcher does want to find, but it's what the participant believes that the researcher wants to find. So they change their behaviour to fit that. So that's your definitions, and I want you to use those for your evaluation. So I want you to pause the video here. You might need a good few minutes to do this, 5, maybe even more to do it. But I want you to bullet point some evaluations for each of the experimental methods and experimental designs. I want you to think about your level of control, the different types of validity, order effects and individual differences. Pause it, give yourself a good 5 minutes really, at least. Try and fill in as much as you can in your first coloured pen. So let's have a look at the evaluations then. We'll start off with our experimental methods and then we'll go to our experimental designs. And remember, these are just bullet points, you don't need to have them written fully, this is just revision. So lab experiment strengths, it has got high levels of control over extraneous variables. That allows us to see a direct cause and effect relationship. That means that our internal validity is probably going to be quite high. But weaknesses, it lacks ecological validity. It's not in a realistic or a real-life setting, so it can't be generalised to other settings. Field experiments is pretty much the opposite way round though. A strength of a field experiment is that ecological validity is pretty high, so it can be generalised to other settings. However, with the weaknesses of a field experiment, we don't have as much control over the extraneous variables, so the validity might drop. We also have issues with ethics. Some people in some field experiments may not know that they are taking part in an experiment. Natural then, strengths, it allows us to study things that wouldn't be ethically possible. So these are naturally occurring things like natural disasters. Obviously ethically we couldn't enforce that on a population, so it allows us to study some diverse things that wouldn't have been possible. However, weakness, it's not replicable, so not reliable really. We can't replicate that again. We don't know when the next natural disaster is going to occur, we can't enforce it, so it has got a lack in the reliability or the replicability. And quasi-experiment, pretty much the same as the lab. It has got high levels of control over our extraneous variables and it allows us to see the direct cause and effect relationship. However, the ecological validity is again going to be low. So that's our experimental methods quickly gone over. Let's look at the experimental designs then. So independent groups first of all. The strengths, we haven't got these order effects. They won't guess the aim, they won't get tired, they won't get bored, they won't get demand characteristics. So that's a positive. However, the negatives are that the results might be influenced by individual differences. So we don't know whether the results or the changes in the dependent variable are actually because of the manipulation of the IV or whether it's because it's two separate groups of people. Repeated measures then, strengths, there are limited individual differences. So there's very, very few. It's the exact same people, so there won't be any differences between the groups. However, we can get these order effects, we can get demand characteristics, so whatever the second condition is, that might change their results. But we have got ways around it, we can counterbalance. So with repeated measures, half of the participants might do condition A, then condition B. The other half of the group will do condition B first, then do condition A. And that sort of levels out the order effects, so we have got ways around it. Matched pairs, again, strengths are that they are two separate groups of people, so there'll be no order effects, and they will be limited individual differences. Even with identical twins, there will still be some differences between them. We're not going to get no individual differences whatsoever, but we've limited them and reduced them down, so that's a strength. But you can put it in the weaknesses that individual differences will have an impact in some way. We can't match everyone exactly, so we've still got that problem. So that's our experimental methods, experimental designs. We've defined them and we've evaluated too. So the next thing I want to look at is ethics. So what are the ethical issues? I want you to just write down some ethical issues. Can you define them? Can you write about them? Give yourself a couple of minutes, pause the video, see where we're up to. So let's look at them then. First of all, we've got informed consent. There's a few ways that you can get this. You can get this retrospectively, so you could get this after the study has been done. You could get prior general consent, so you could get an individual to consent to numerous studies across a certain time period, and you could ask a similar group to see whether they would also agree to take part, and if they are very similar to the individuals you want to test, you can test them. You can get a gatekeeper consent, so like a parent can for a child, or a doctor, teacher, someone in responsibility can consent for a child or someone who is in a specific position. The next ones we've got are deception, so lying essentially. Confidentiality, so all the data has to be kept confidential, so that might be by making it anonymous. The right to withdraw, participants must always have the right to withdraw all the way through the study. Privacy, so again, sort of similar to confidentiality, they go together really. Privacy, so keeping the individual's personal information private and not sharing that with anyone else. And protection from harm, that's psychological harm and physical harm that we must be protected from. So that's your different ethical issues. The next thing I'd like you to do is write about how we can address these ethical issues. So how is it that when we've gone through a study, we might have had to break deception a little bit? What do we then have to do afterwards? So write it in a little bit of detail. What would you do if you had to break these ethical guidelines for a study? What would you do? So hopefully your answer is a debrief. Every single psychological study has to have a debrief to it, and it has to include certain things, especially if a lot of the ethical issues have been broken. Now remember, for Britain, it is the British Psychological Society that go through these guidelines and you have to get approval from. They're not going to let you break every single guideline just because you've done a debrief, but it gives you a little bit more leeway. And in a debrief, you must include the true aims, so exactly what you were aiming to do. You have to include information of what all the groups did. So if there was 2-3 different groups, tell the participant what exactly each group did. You have to apologise for deceiving them and tell them why it was necessary. Now you can't just say because we could have got demand characteristics. An individual might not know what that means. So we need to give reasons why, but without psychological key terms. We also need to offer support with contact details, and we might have to request the retrospective consent, especially if we've lied to them quite a lot. We will have to ask for their consent again. Now, the last thing I want you to do with ethics is write about a study that you've seen that breaks a lot of ethical guidelines. Now, there's quite a few that you could go for. Pick any one, briefly describe how they have broken the ethical guidelines in that box at the bottom of the booklet, if that is where you are writing your notes. So hopefully you've got a study there, you've got a couple of options, or you've got many options really. The main ones are Milgram and Zimbardo. A lot of psychological harm caused by both of them, a lot of deception, things like that. So make sure you know the reasons why that study might not be ethical. Make sure you check with your booklet, why is this ethical, why is it not ethical, and what should have been done otherwise? Why was this study important? Things like that I want you to think about. So that's all of the things that I'm going to physically go through. Now we need a little bit of exam practice really. So on the next pages, we've got some exam practice. Here is the scenario. So this is the scenario. In your booklet, you've got the questions for them. So there's 19 marks worth of questions. I want you to give yourself 26 minutes, time it. If you need to go for a break now, do it now. Go get some food, get a drink, whatever you need, and then time yourself and sit for 26 minutes without your notes and just solidly answer all of these questions. Once you've done your 26 minutes, start the video again, and then I'll go through some exam questions, mark schemes. You can tick them off, give yourself an approximate mark, make your corrections. So time yourself 26 minutes, pause the video whilst you're doing that, and we will go through the mark scheme too. So swap your colour pen. Make sure you've got your second colour so you can see exactly what it is that you need to change and exactly what it is that is causing you a problem really. So the first question says, write a brief consent form that would have been suitable for use in this experiment. Now you need to double check. You need to check that you have written this in a letter format. It has to be in a letter. You need to give a general overview of what the participants would be asked to do. So you might have to tell them that you're going to watch an assigned horror film every night before you go to bed for 7 nights, and then you'll be assigned a romantic comedy to watch for 7 nights. You also need to tell them that they'll be required to truthfully respond to a text message about a nightmare, and they'd have to do this for 14 days altogether. You'd also have to explain that they would be able to withdraw at any time. You might suggest how they can withdraw, like text stop back to the number. You have to explain to them that their data is going to be kept anonymous, and you have to leave space for them to sign. It's a consent form, so it has to have a space to sign in there. So just make some corrections. Make sure it has included all of these things. The important thing here isn't giving yourself a mark out of 6. The important thing is seeing what you needed to improve on. So add in anything, pause the video whilst you're doing it so you can double check the mark scheme and check your notes. Next question then. B. The psychologist proposed a directional hypothesis. Write a directional hypothesis. So for 3 marks you have to have fully operationalised the hypothesis. And you can see the breakdown for 3, 2 and 1 mark. An example is there at the bottom of the screen. So the amount of nightmares reported after watching a horror film will be greater than the amount of nightmares reported after watching a romantic comedy film. So the dependent variable has been said twice, amount of nightmares reported. And then amount of nightmares reported is said again. And then your IV is said twice, so it's romantic comedy or horror film, they're both included, and then you have to say whether you think one is going to be better than the other. Now there's no issue about you saying it the other way around, saying will be less than, so romantic comedies will get more nightmares. There's no issue with you saying that, but most likely the majority of you will have said that watching a horror film will gain more nightmares. So that's B. Again, pause it if you need to, so you can write on to your answer the examples that you need. Question C then is the psychologist used a repeated measures design in this experiment. Explain why it was important to use repeated measures design in this case. Now the possible explanations is essentially to avoid the individual differences in the frequency of nightmares. Some people might have more nightmares than others, and it might so happen that they are all in the horror section. So repeated measures sort of eliminates those individual differences. It also eliminates the impact of things like gender, film viewing habits, because some people will watch horror films generally all the time, some people won't watch them at all. Hours of sleep, all of these can have a big impact upon the number of nightmares recalled, so it's important that it's repeated so that factors like this do not impact the study. 2 more questions to go then, D and E. So D is the psychologist used counterbalancing in this experiment. Explain why it is appropriate to use counterbalancing. You have to explain that order effects are very likely to occur, so that gets you 1 mark, saying that order effects are likely. You then have to explain what that means. So you have to say that if you saw the horror films in the first week, you might still be thinking about them and have high levels of fear in the second week, resulting in more nightmares. So it's important to counterbalance, which is half of them will watch a romantic comedy for the first week and then a horror for the second, and the other half will do a horror for the first week and a romantic comedy for the second. And that levels out the order effects, and it reduces the chance that they're still thinking about the first week's film and they are still resulting in nightmares from that. So make sure that you've included how that will impact the results overall. And then the last question then is, E says explain how the psychologist could randomly split the sample of 50 students into the 2 groups. It says you get 1 mark for each of the following up to the 3 marks. So you could put all 50 participants' names into a hat, a container or a computer. You don't have to put all 3, just say one of them, whichever you choose to do. Then you need to say a name is drawn from the container or hat, or you could say a random name is generated from the computer and is assigned to group number 1. Then you need to say a second name is selected and it goes into the second group, and the process continues until there are 25 in each group. You would be okay to say the first 25 go into group 1, the second 25 go into group 2, but try and make sure you say what group 1 and group 2 means. Don't just leave it as group. So try and make sure you are being a little bit more specific. So that's all your exam questions done. Hopefully you can see where you're making improvements, but you can also see where you need to revise a little bit more, and that's what you can focus on over the next few days or weeks if you've got that amount of time. But I want you to make a note of anything else that you're not sure of. So over the 2 research methods revision videos that I've done, we've gone through sampling methods, aims, independent variable, dependent variable with hypothesis writing. We've gone through experimental methods, experimental design, ethics, and we've gone through exam practice on it. Make a list of anything you're still not sure of, including those subjects, but also things that you may not have revised through these videos, and that can be your focus for your revision. Make a bit of a plan of when are you going to revise it, how are you going to revise it, and stick to it. If you've got a time frame to do it, you're more likely to be successful in your revision. But that's everything that we are going through on these 2 videos. Hopefully they've been useful to you. Keep pushing with the revision, and I'm sure you'll be successful in anything else that you may be doing in any assessments, as long as you are pushing your revision.